rid of my sticky.
You can. So welcome. All right, before I start, Karen, why don't you say a few words?
Sure, just very briefly, just welcome and or welcome back. This is the third class on Baruch Spinoza, and it's just been a terrific series and very enjoyable, informative, very challenging concepts to wrap your head around, but it's good. We need that kind of exercise as well as, getting outside and walking and all that stuff. I'm going to put in the chat the link to our YouTube channel, and we'll be posting all of the lectures on there. The first two are on there, as well as the Maimonides lectures from a couple months ago. So if you miss them or you want to watch them again, they will be there. Again, thank you to everybody who's been here. Thank you to our donors. Thank you to our anonymous sponsor. And take it away, Rabbi.
Great. Next week, we're going to meet one more time with Professor Michael Rosenthal of the University of Toronto, who is an expert on Spinoza. He writes and lectures on Spinoza, and so he'll have some further depth to offer us. And so save all your hard questions for next week. You can lob me the easy ones this week. And then the other thing I'll mention since we're here is that this Friday is our annual Bernstein Scholar in Residence program, this year sponsored by Peter and Joy Vanek. So thank you, Vanek. We're so excited about this weekend. Our scholar is Rabbi Jeff Salkin, who will be speaking on the secret chord, Jewish music or Jewish values in pop music, the music of Leonard Cohen, Paul Simon, and Bob Dylan. And so there's a lecture. You probably all saw your email already, but there's a lecture Friday night immediately following Rosh Shabbat. There's one Saturday morning, and Saturday morning begins at 9, not 9:15. If you come at 9:15, you'll miss the first 15 minutes. So please come at 9. And then Saturday night at 7:30, where we're having Havdalah and a third lecture. And it all sounds really interesting. I can't wait.
So the 7 o'clock that's announced, is that for the lecture, or is that for the service first, 7?
Service is at 6, Rosh Shabbat at 6, lecture at 7 immediately following. It's all the same. And feel free to eat dinner during one or the other. We don't want people to miss it because we recognize it's 2 hours in a row and we don't want you to miss it for dinner. So please don't hesitate to stay and eat dinner. So let's say the blessing. I'm just going to share my screen here, and where's the blessing? Here it is. And we'll say the blessing for study, and then we will launch in to our third session here. Okay, let's say together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal one, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to study words of Torah. So we're here for our third session on this guy, Baruch/Benedict Spinoza. We met him 2 weeks ago, and we saw that he lived a short and not easy life, but that he was a brilliant scholar and a brilliant philosopher who in many ways really paved the way for modernity as we know it, for liberal religion as we know it. We started off 2 weeks ago by looking at some of his very early work, where he essentially outlines his own philosophical quest for what he calls the good, or the highest good, I think is the language he uses, which he associates with an understanding of nature and an understanding of what he calls what's the word he uses exactly? The synthesis between the mind and nature. Synthesis is not his word, but it's something like that. Essentially knowing that you are part of a larger whole, which is nature. And that for that reason, he sets off from a world which largely values things like wealth and sensual pleasure, and moves toward a philosophical journey of exploring, learning more about the world through science and through rationality. And Spinoza is a rationalist as opposed to an empiricist, so he values the use of reason above all other things, including above what you can see by observing the world around you. So for Spinoza, human reason is the highest form of learning about the world around us. Last week, we looked at his extremely complicated treatise on his views of God, which is called the Ethics, or the beginning of the book, the work that's called the Ethics. And if you remember, Spinoza's Ethics was the book he never published because he was probably too afraid to, because it was so controversial, the things that he was saying, that he, first of all, had gotten himself kicked out of the Jewish community, had gotten himself condemned by the church, condemned by the Jewish community to the church, and condemned by the Jewish community to the Dutch state. So those are probably a lot of the reasons that Spinoza never published the Ethics. But we saw last week, through his very convoluted geometrical system, that Spinoza essentially associates God with nature. He says that God is not a separate being who makes the world. God is not a being who has a will or a personality. God is rather the totality of all that is. God is nature, which doesn't only mean physical nature, not just the matter you see around you, but also the non-physical parts of nature, such as the laws of nature and the ideas that exist in nature. God is the totality of all of that. And he says, by extension, God cannot and does not act outside of the laws of nature. So we saw last week that we questioned, is it really God if it is simply nature? If there's nothing besides the natural world around us and the laws of nature, is there really a God there? Is there really a there, we might say? And the answer to that is, well, Spinoza tells us that he's not an atheist, but he was accused of atheism at the same time. He's talking about God, he's talking about religion. He clearly, as we're going to see this week, he clearly cares about religion. But he's also deeply critical of religion. He talks about, he writes about the importance of the Bible by way of criticizing the way people have read the Bible for the last 200 years. So Spinoza cares about religion and cares about the idea of God, but his God is very different than what anybody else had imagined or thought of as being God up to that point. As we meet Spinoza again for this third session, we're going to be reading a third work of his. The first one, the one that we read the first week, was called, I can never remember the name of it, was called The Treatise on the Emendation of the Intellect. The second thing that we read last week was called The Ethics. And this week, what we're going to read is called the Theological Political Treatise. I have good news for you. This is not written in a geometrical style. There's no, axioms and derived propositions and things like that. This week we're reading something that sounds more like philosophy to us, but the views are the same. He's still talking about the same kinds of ideas, but here he's talking about them in ways that are more persuasive and less mathematical. By the way, one of the reasons, just to talk one more second about last week, one of the reasons that Spinoza wrote the Ethics in a mathematical or geometric style was because he didn't want to have to rely on persuasion and rhetoric to convince people of his ideas. He wasn't looking to convince you because he was a great orator. He wasn't looking to persuade you by means of emotion or make you feel connected to his ideas. He was looking to prove, in his mind, to prove things beyond a shadow of a doubt mathematically. He was looking to prove what could be proven from propositions that derive from certain axioms. And so he ultimately wrote the Ethics in that style because he thought persuasion was a lesser form of proof, essentially, than mathematics. The work we're going to read right now is older than the Ethics. He published this during his lifetime. This may have been, I have to go back and see, but this may have been the work that got him excommunicated. I can't remember. But if it was, then you'll see why in just a minute. So we're going to turn, for those who have the text in front of you, we're going to turn to page 20 in the text. I want to read the preface to the Theological Political Treatise, not exactly in its entirety, but read a bunch of it. And then we're going to run through questions of how does this apply to his view of religion, of organized religion, or what we might call traditional religion, how it applies to his view of society, and then ultimately of how people make meaning in the world. So let's see, as usual, I'll call in somebody. You can always tell me no if you don't want to read. Phil, would you read the first paragraph for us, please?
If men were able to exercise complete control over all their circumstances, or if continuous good fortune were always their lot, they would never be prey to superstition. But since they are often reduced to such straits as to be without any resource, and their immoderate greed for fortune's fickle favors, that's pretty good alliteration, fortune's fickle favors often makes them the wretched victims of alternating hopes and fears. The result is that, for the most part, their credulity knows no bounds. In critical times, they are swayed this way or that by the slightest impulse, especially so when they are wavering between the emotions of hope and fear. Yet at other times, they're overconfident, boastful, and arrogant.
All right. So what Spinoza is saying here, he's essentially saying something that sounds like people will believe anything. You won't believe what people will believe. If people were always in control of their faculties and were always making decisions by means of reason, we wouldn't have this problem, he says. But because people are often scared or hopeful or going through dire straits or expecting better things to come, therefore, I love how he puts it, their credulity knows no bounds. People will believe anything. And so much of what people believe is not reasonable. I was going to use another word that was not, proper for polite speech, but essentially is not reasonable. And so he says, because of that is the birth of superstition. Superstition, he says, is essentially born out of our hopes and our fears, and especially out of our fears. And I'm down here now. Then again, he says, if they are struck by wonder at some unusual phenomenon, they believe this to be a portent signifying anger of the gods or of a supreme deity, and they therefore regard it as a pious duty to avert the evil by sacrifice and vows, susceptible as they are to superstition and opposed to religion. Thus, there is no end to the kind of omens that they imagine, and they read extraordinary things into nature, as if the whole of nature were a partner in their madness. Spinoza may not have been the nicest guy to sit down and have dinner with. I want to postulate that. I mean, he was not. He's often quite sarcastic in his work, and he's also often quite, let's call it derisive. He's often quite derisive of people who believe differently than him, and especially of people whose beliefs include superstitions or the regular performance of rituals, or the idea that my prayers will somehow have an effect on God. So he's not always the nicest about these things, but it's very clear what he's saying here about religion. He's essentially saying that a lot of what we call religious is actually born out of, I would say, fear and emotion run amok. That the people have this need to hope that things can be better, or that they are afraid of what things will be, and so therefore they perform sacrifices and vows, or they imagine that this is a result of the anger of the gods or of a supreme deity. So here, in one fell swoop, he has lumped together pagans and Christians and Jews all in one sentence of people who turn to supposed supernatural means in order to allay their fears or fulfill their hopes. So in all of this, here, let's just read one more paragraph about this. Actually, Phil, if you and your friend there don't mind reading one more paragraph for us.
This being the case, we see that it is particularly those who greedily covet fortune's favors who are the readiest victims of superstition of every kind. And it is especially when they are helpless in danger that they all implore God's help with prayers and womanish tears.
Sorry for the sexism there.
Reason they call blind, because it cannot reveal a sure way to the vanities that they covet. And human wisdom they call vain, while the delusions of the imagination, dreams, and other childish absurdities are taken to be the oracles of God. Indeed, they think that God, spurning the wise, has written his decrees not in man's mind, but in the entrails of beasts, or that by divine inspiration and instigation these decrees are foretold by fools, madmen, or birds. To such madness are men driven by their fears.
He's describing traditional religious practices here, and both biblical practices as well as later Jewish practices and Christian practices, and also what sounds like a kind of a stereotype of magical religion, entrails of beasts. I mean, we have this described in the Bible, and we know that this would happen. They would kill an animal, and they would lay out its entrails in a certain way and try to predict what happens. Or this is like tea leaves, or your magic 8-ball, or whatever it is that predicts something. Spinoza says that this is the result of like we said before, fear run amok, and also ambition run amok. I mean, look what he's talking here. These are particularly those who greedily covet fortune's favors. And if you remember what we read 2 weeks ago, he said most of what people value in this world is riches, honor, and sensual pleasure. I'm departing from that, he says. I'm going to seek knowledge through philosophy, through the application of reason. But what most people care about is riches, honor, and sensual pleasures, which here he calls fortune's favors. And that leads people off the rails into superstition. But it gets worse than that. Not only are people led into all these superstitions, he says, but that has a negative effect on the kind of society that we can have. So here's where his religious and his political philosophy are going to come together. Sandy, would you mind reading for us here, granted?
Granted, then, that the supreme mystery of despotism, its prop and stay, is to keep men in a state of deception, and with the specious title of religion to cloak the fear by which they must be held in check, so that they will fight for their servitude as if for salvation, and count it no shame, but the highest honor to spend their blood and their lives for the glorification of one man. Yet no more disastrous policy can be devised or attempted in a free commonwealth. To invest with prejudice or in any way coerce the citizens' free judgment is altogether incompatible with the freedom of the people. As for those persecutions that are incited under the cloak of religion, they surely have their only source in this, that law intrudes into the realm of speculative thought, and that beliefs are put on trial and condemned as crimes. The adherents and followers of these beliefs are sacrificed, not to the public weal, but to the hatred and savagery of their opponents. If under civil law only deeds were arraigned and words not punished, persecutions of this kind would be divested of any appearance of legality, and disagreement would not turn into persecution.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. So anybody want to try to unpack it for us? What is Spinoza arguing in this paragraph? Anybody want to try it? I know, it's not that it has a few big words. It actually only has a few small words. So he's just finished criticizing religion as something born out of fear, essentially. He then moves on to criticize those governments that keep people in check through religion and fear and coercion. So he calls it here the supreme mystery of despotism, that what sits at the center of despotism, by which really he means monarchy, what sits at the center of despotism or monarchy is to keep people in a state of deception, with the specious title of religion to cloak the fear. In other words, he's criticizing the way that religion is used by the state to control people into essentially, what he puts it in this incredible way, into fighting for their own servitude, he says. Thinking of servitude as salvation, where true salvation, according to Spinoza, is to know about the world, is to have your own freedom to learn and to speculate and to think about things. Salvation, as the church has defined it, is essentially defined as serving the state, serving the king, Spinoza says. So you can see already how this got him excommunicated by the Jewish community and had him under wraps by the state, because it sounds subversive to both the church and to the state at the same time. And if this sounds like John Locke or Thomas Jefferson or the American Declaration of Independence, that's because they had read him. Because the ideas that he's espousing here will later be used to form liberal democratic societies like the one that we live in today. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm a little confused here. Is he is he, I can't think of the word, but is he criticizing political leaders who use religion, or is he criticizing the real religious leaders?
So he's doing both. I think, he's an equal opportunity criticizer here. In this paragraph, he's criticizing political leaders who use religion. But up above and elsewhere as well, we saw this elsewhere, but up above here, he's criticizing religion as it stands. He was essentially saying people get sucked into this, people get sucked into these superstitious practices. And there are people who want to stay in power, both in the political and in the religious realms, who play on people's fears that lead to these superstitions in order to stay in power. So his solutions to this, as we're going to see going forward, will be both political and religious. He's going to call for a rethinking of how we read the Bible, which is why he's a Jewish thinker, right? We could be reading Thomas Jefferson here, but we're not reading Thomas Jefferson in a Jewish context. But the reason he's a Jewish thinker is because he's calling for a rethinking of religion. He's calling for a rethinking of what it means to relate to the Bible and to religious practice. And in so doing, he believes the state will no longer be able to control people into acting in certain ways. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I interpreted it differently. I thought he was talking about religious leaders coercing people, or I thought he was saying that people's religious beliefs should be whatever they think is right and not whatever the religious leaders are telling them is right.
Well, he's saying that also. And Martin Luther, who lived about a century before Spinoza, who had kicked off the Protestant Reformation, had in some ways said something similar. Luther was not as a free thinker the way Spinoza is, but Luther does say, I don't want the church to tell me what the Bible says anymore. I'll read the Bible for myself and have a relationship with the Bible. What Luther doesn't do, which Spinoza does, as we're going to see, is to begin to read the Bible critically, not as the word of God, but as the word of human beings. So Spinoza is most definitely saying what you're saying about people being able to form their own religious beliefs. But he's also, if you look here, he's talking about the law, right? Persecutions that are incited under the cloak of religion. He's talking about people being persecuted by the state for their religious beliefs, where that beliefs are put on trial and condemned as crimes. The other thing to remember is that there wasn't the same separation between religion and state then that there is now. So, that Spinoza had come from a family that had fled Spain and fled the Inquisition. Was the Inquisition a Catholic Church enterprise, or was it an enterprise of the Crown of Spain? Well, the answer is yes, right? The two were in partnership to persecute and control people's beliefs in order to maintain the power of the state and of the church. That's what Spinoza is calling out here. Alex, I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, actually, you covered a bit of what I wanted to mention, Rabbi, and it is that partly he might have been inspired by Spain in those comments, because first of all, Spain and his country were in an unfriendly competition for dominion of the world, and but Spain was much more strongly allied with the church, and the Inquisition was in all rage. Even though we tend to remember, Inquisition at the time of Isabel la Católica in the 17th century, it continued. Actually, probably ended in the 19th or 20th century. I think it was the formal end of the Inquisition. So many of his statements could have made more sense if applied to Spain than to his country, actually. That's what I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I agree. And remember that, he's living in the Netherlands, but I think his parents came from Spain. So he wasn't very far removed from people that had fled the Inquisition to the Netherlands because it was a place where there was greater religious freedom. Spinoza couldn't have written this in Spain. He would have been executed for writing this in Spain. He could write it in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, he only got excommunicated and watched by the government, right? In Spain, he would have been executed. And so there's no question that his family experience and that communal experience as Sephardic Jews had influenced the way he thought about this. So Spinoza has set us up here, criticizing, as we said, both the church and the state, both the way people practice religion and the way that the state is organized. And he, oh, by the way, this is interesting. And the way that I'm here now, and the way that they prop up each other's power. So that's essentially what he's criticizing here. The way that people's rights are curtailed in order to control them, people's rights to their own beliefs and freedoms. And again, if this sounds like liberal democracy, it's because he's beginning to advocate for something that will look like liberal democracy. And so, is Spinoza advocating for separation of religion and state? Well, in some ways, maybe, except that what Spinoza is really doing is advocating for a different kind of religion. That religion in the Bible, as far as he's concerned, are rational documents. And we're going to see that he calls for a new reading of the Bible as a human document written by human hands, and as a document that elevates reason. And reason, Spinoza believes, will call for a different kind of state, essentially, a state that will be a state of all of its people. I thought that was in here, but it doesn't seem to be. So Anita and Norm, I see your hand, then we'll read the next paragraph.
Yeah, it was just my hand. Yeah, I just think in this argument, the way it's been put forward, that we should make sure to balance this geopolitical sort of argument about how humans are the victims of people who want power with what I think he's fundamentally saying is that humans have a weakness for becoming anxious and fearful, and they harness all kinds of ideas in order to solve that, either in the short or long term. Other people use that in grandiose ways. And of course, people become victimized by their own weakness. But I don't think we should forget that the fundamental problem is the human condition.
Yeah, I agree with you, Norm. He is saying that. And that's why, in part, Spinoza is calling for if you remember from 2 weeks ago, he's calling for an educational revolution. He's calling for what we would call universal education. He's calling for philosophy to be taught to as many people as possible. Unlike Maimonides, who believed that philosophy was for the elite, Spinoza believes everybody should be able to learn philosophy. And the more of us that are learning how to use our faculty of reason, the fewer of us will fall prey to the superstition and to the coercive controls that are put on us because of our emotions, because of our deep emotional reactions, our fear and our hope that things can be better than they are. Phil, go ahead.
I'm wondering what Spinoza thought about the prophets. Did he feel that they had any kind of greater knowledge or connection to whatever God is?
So, yes, he did, but not in the same way that, for example, Maimonides did. Maimonides believed, and so this actually gets into our next topic, which is how did Spinoza read the Bible? So actually, Phil, let's read one more paragraph, and then I'll answer that because it kind of segues us into the next thing. So if you'll read right here, when I pondered, since you've read this whole page already.
When I pondered over these facts, that the light of reason is not only despised, but is condemned by many as a source of impiety, that merely human suppositions are regarded as divine doctrine, and that credulity is looked upon as faith. And when I saw that the disputes of philosophers are raging with violent passion in church and court, and are breeding bitter hatred and faction which readily turn men to sedition, together with other ills too numerous to recount here, I deliberately resolved to examine Scripture afresh, conscientiously and freely, and to admit nothing as its teaching which I did not most clearly derive from it.
Anybody else surprised by the end of that sentence? It sounds like he's going to say, I decided to foment a revolution, or I decided to assassinate the king, but no, he decided to read Scripture afresh. All of these thoughts about emotion and reason, and about the ways that people are controlled, both by their own fears and their own superstitions, and by other powerful men who take advantage of our fears and our superstitions. All of that leads him not to want to overthrow the government, at least maybe not yet, but rather to reread the Bible, because he wants to read the Bible. He believes that the ways that we read the Bible sit at the center of many of the problems in our society, because they allow us to be controlled and coerced by our own fears and superstitions, and by powerful people who would take advantage of them. So he now turns to, what does the Bible really say as far as he's concerned, and who were the people who wrote the Bible? And Spinoza will now say something that might sound to you like something we all know, but in his day, it was a groundbreaking idea. And that is that the Bible was written by people, and that the Bible represents what people knew in the time that they wrote it. So Dawn, go ahead, and then we'll move on to the next page.
Last week, I asked the question, not where does religion fit into this? Last week, we discussed how he proved God exists. He obviously believes God is an entity, is the entity, because we all are part of God and etc. But I still don't understand where prayer fits into this. Not critical thinking of the Bible, which is, he's going to do a rational examination of the Bible, I would imagine, and that's what's coming. But religion is more than its, the excesses, I suppose. It's much more personal, right? A personal relationship with God, rather than a communal experience of what religion controls.
Yep.
I still don't see where that's coming from, or does it come from?
So I want to put a pin in that for right now, Dawn, because we're going to get, in a little while, we're going to get to the question of ritual and what is the purpose of ritual. And I mean, the spoiler alert here is that Spinoza is not very positive toward ritual. Ultimately, his answer to that question may be that prayer isn't necessary. And we then get to criticize that. And again, we'll talk more about this later. We get to criticize that as post-Spinozans, who can say, well, yes, it is. It can serve other purposes besides the purposes you think it's not serving. But for Spinoza, I think he's again, I'll say more about this later, but I think he's not yet in a place where he can see religion in a liberal way, because he's living in a world that has never known liberal Judaism or liberal Christianity. And so his answer to that question may well be that you don't need to perform these rituals. We then get to argue with him because we live after him. Well, again, we'll get there. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
It seems to me that in the first few paragraphs that we read, he is arguing against both church and state. And I don't quite see, given that, I don't understand, maybe I'm being stupid, but I don't understand how he gets to, okay, let's look at scripture.
Well, so, all right, let's keep going, because I think it'll become clear why he's concerned with scripture, why he's concerned with reading the Bible, because it actually does relate for him to church and to state. So actually, I don't know, Peter, are you able to see the screen in order to read from where you are? No, that's okay. I won't make you. Let me explain a little bit about what's going on here, and then we're going to read what he means. We're going to read his redefinition of divine law. So first of all, Spinoza is going to define the word law for us. He's going to say, we actually use the word law to refer to two different things. One of the things that we use the word law to refer to is law, he says, taken in its absolute sense, means that according to which each individual thing act in one and the same fixed and determinate manner. For example, if I take this pen and drop it, it will fall to the earth. Because of what? The law of gravity, right? That's a law, he says. But we also use the word law to refer to something, refer to something different, to refer to something that depends on human will. So you have laws based on nature's necessity, which is to say the way things act by virtue of the laws of nature. And notice that we also use the word law there. And then we have laws that are based on human will, which is to say that people control one another for both good and bad reasons by virtue of statutes that they lay down. Now, within all those laws, all right, Peter and Joy, go ahead. I see your hand. Vanix, did you have a hand up?
Yes, I did. I just wanted to ask, where does ethics fit in? Or does it for him?
So it does, in the sense that Spinoza believes that reasonable people will want good for each other. That the more reasonable you are, the more you exercise the faculty of reason, the more you will want good for others. And in part, and again, we're going to see this in a few minutes, a society is a place where people curtail a little bit of their rights in order that others might have rights also. So, in theory, if I am a fully free being, I can kill you. But that would be a curtailment of your rights. Therefore, I give up my right to kill you and you give up your right to kill me so that we can be a society together. So ethics for him in part is what's good for people. And that's where he says, when we read this last week, I think, where he says that ethics are not absolute. Ethics, that good and bad is something that's good and bad for people. But underpinning that is the idea that all reasonable people want what's best for themselves. That is, they want to continue to exist. And they also then want that for each other. And that is essentially the underpinning of ethics as far as he's concerned. And statute or law can be the way that is controlled or put into effect. Yes, Vanix, go ahead.
Okay, this is really talking out of both sides of his mouth. On one hand, he says that a reasonable person is going to want to be reasonable in order to create a better society so that we can all basically look after one another. On the other hand, he says, now we have the leaders of the church and the leaders of the state doing everything they can to control people. If they're controlling me, it's not in my best interest.
Right. Oh, well, because he believes that those people aren't operating by reason. And that's why he believes in universal education. Everybody should be educated in philosophy and everybody should be educated in science, because the more we learn about the world, the more we exercise the faculty of reason, the higher we reach toward the good. And if most people learn as much as possible and we all exercise the faculty of reason, then actually we can create a more just society based on what we all want. And while that might sound strange, it's also in many ways the foundation of democracy. Democracy trusts the people to be reasonable and elect leaders who will want what's best for everybody. So that's where I think he's not talking out of both sides of his mouth in that sense, that he actually really, I think he really fully, honestly believes in the power of reason, in the power of science and learning and intellect and philosophy to produce reasonable people who can produce a reasonable society. What does that have to do with the Bible? Well, here's what it has to do with the Bible. So he's defined law. He's told us there's two kinds of laws, right? Laws that come out of nature's necessity and laws that come out of human will. Within that, he says there's another two kinds of laws that he calls human and divine law. So human law, I'll read it right here. By human law, I mean a prescribed rule of conduct whose sole aim is to safeguard life and the commonwealth. So human law here are those laws we put into place in order to safeguard our own lives that are good for us, that essentially need to exist so that we can have a society. By divine law, I'm right here, I mean that which is concerned only with the supreme good, that is the true knowledge and love of God. This law I call divine because the nature of the supreme good, which I shall now briefly explain as clearly as I can. So what he actually means here in terms of divine law is those intellectual and ethical processes that bring us to an understanding of God, or those intellectual processes that bring us to an understanding of God that will lead us to behave in ethical ways, to your question, Peter and Joy. So he continues here. Since our intellect forms the better part of us, it is evident that if we wish to seek what is definitely to our advantage, we should endeavor above all to perfect it, to perfect our intellect as far as we can. For in its perfection must consist our supreme good. Now, since all our knowledge depends solely on the knowledge of God, it follows that our supreme good and perfection depends solely on the knowledge of God. Again, since nothing can be, well, actually, we'll skip that part. So I'm down here now. So he who loves above all the intellectual cognition of God, the most perfect being, and takes a special delight therein, is necessarily most perfect and partakes most in the highest blessedness. So the means required to achieve this end of all human action, that is God insofar as his idea exists in us, may be termed God's commands. For they are ordained for us by God himself, as it were, insofar as he exists in our minds. So the rules for living a life that has regard to this can fitly be called the divine law. So what is divine law? Divine law is those things, those statutes or laws that lead us to what he calls intellectual perfection, that lead us to what he talked about our very first few minutes together 2 weeks ago, to that closeness with God that has to do with understanding the world around you in order to understand your own connection to God and the nature of the world around you. So that might be the law. Truly, he associates that largely with laws of ethics that had to do with loving your neighbor as yourself, treating other people well as intellectual pursuit that helps us to ponder and draw closer to the nature of God, which is also nature. So let me just put that to the side for a second. We have now this thing called divine law. Divine law is that which draws us closer to God. He has a few things to say about what divine law is, which will be challenging for the Bible as we know it. Number one, it is of universal application or common to all mankind, for we have deduced it from human nature as such. Number two, it does not demand belief in historical narratives of any kind whatsoever. For since it is merely a consideration of human nature that leads us to divine law, evidently it applies equally to Adam as to any other man, and equally to a man living in a community as a hermit. However, he says, although belief in historical narratives cannot afford us knowledge and love of God, I do not believe that their study, this should say I do. I do not deny. I do not deny that their study can be very profitable in the matter of social relations. So he's essentially said that divine law, this set of statutes or capabilities that lead us to know God through intellect and through ethics, number one, are universal. That's a problem for the Bible because remember, the Bible says that the Jews are the chosen people and God chose us above everybody else. Number two, they do not demand belief in historical narratives. So the historical narrative of the Jews being the chosen people has nothing to do with divine law, he says. Divine law is that which we can derive through the faculty of reason. However, study of historical narratives can be good for our social connections, for our relationships, for our connections to one another. He's not denying that the Bible is useful or that those narratives are useful. He is denying, though, that out of studying our narratives, we learn divine law. Number three, we see that the natural divine law does not enjoin ceremonial rites, that is, actions which in and of themselves are of no significance and are termed good merely by tradition, or which symbolize some good necessary for salvation. Lighting Shabbat candles on Friday night does not actually, as far as he's concerned, bring you closer to an understanding of God. we could argue that point, right? And that's where later thinkers, such as Mordechai Kaplan or someone like that, will come along and say there is divine content or divine goodness to these rituals that we perform, and that maybe connection with other people is a place that we find God, as Martin Buber says, or that in understanding relationships or understanding the capacity to love or understanding legacy, we do find God, as Mordechai Kaplan says. So that's where we might argue that there is divine content to these ceremonial rituals. Spinoza seems to be aligned with the early classical reformers who essentially say, we don't need that stuff. That stuff is not part of our religion. And when the Bible is, as we'll see in a minute, when the Bible is requiring certain rituals, it's for specific reasons, for specific historical and sociological reasons. Vanix, go ahead.
Rabbi, this piece that we're reading, this treatise that we're reading, preceded the ethics that we read last week.
Yes.
So it seems to me that he's doing something backwards. And that is, he's assuming the existence of God, and he's assuming that God is nature without proving that. And that doesn't seem to fit with everything that we've learned so far about Spinoza. It's not reasoned or reasonable.
Mm-hmm. Well, so he actually does have a chapter in the Theological Political Treatise about that. He doesn't do it in the same geometric style, which he would do it in 10 years later, but he does argue that already. He argues it very early in his work, so he has said it. Has he proven it from a geometrical sense? I'm not sure. I don't know enough about what he writes in this treatise to be able to say. But that is the God that he's working with here. And anybody who would have read chapter 2, which we didn't read, would know that that's the God that he's working with here. So,
Thank you. That helps.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So, okay. So what I won't read here is his argument here that the Bible is actually quite positive about reason, about divine law. He says the Bible is quite a reasonable document, except in the places where it's not. And this goes to Phil's question before about who are the prophets. Maimonides had said that the prophets were great philosophers. The prophets were those who combined the faculty of intellect and imagination, that they contained a superior intellect. Maimonides, by the way, believed that he contained a superior intellect also, but so did the prophets. They were superior intellects, and they had an extraordinary faculty of imagination, which allowed them both to understand from God what the laws were and to imagine a society that would implement those ideas. So that's what Maimonides says a philosopher is. For Spinoza, philosophers are essentially only the second part. They have a great imagination and they have actually a great ethic. They are the philosophers are incredibly ethical, moral, imaginative people in the sense that they can imagine a society that's better than the one we live in. They can imagine a world where people treat each other ethically. So they are of high ethical content, essentially. But the philosophers are not necessarily of great intellectual or scientific content. So where Maimonides essentially says that the prophet, I said philosophers, I meant the prophets. Maimonides essentially says that the prophets were philosophers. Spinoza says the prophets were not. They were ethics teachers. The prophets only had the scientific knowledge that they had, and we have other scientific knowledge that they didn't have. Therefore, we can look back on their book and we can say things like, oh, they didn't understand that thing about the world. They didn't know where the world comes, the origin of the universe. They couldn't have possibly understood that the world has always existed just as it is, as opposed to God creating it, Spinoza might have said. In that sense, Spinoza is a progressive. He believes that scientific knowledge is progressing over time, and that we have more knowledge than previous people did. Is he right about that? Well, Aristotle knew a whole lot of things. The ancient Greeks knew a whole lot of things. But this is one of the ideas of early modernity, that the world is emerging from the Dark Ages and that we are slowly building this corpus of scientific knowledge that will help us understand things that our ancestors didn't understand. So therefore, the way Spinoza and Maimonides read the Bible is actually very different, even though they're both rationalists, in the sense that Maimonides reads it Maimonides reads the Bible as a document that must agree with his own philosophy. And we saw him jumping through hoops to make it agree with his own philosophy. Spinoza reads the Bible as a document written by people who didn't know stuff that he knows. So therefore, even though the Bible contains matters of divine law, which is to say ethics, the Bible also contains a whole lot of stuff that, people just didn't know better then. And which takes us to two questions: the question of miracles, which we'll look at second, and the question of ritual, which we'll look at first. So what would Spinoza have said about ritual? This is the question that Dawn keeps asking. What about prayer? What about ritual? Isn't religion built around the rituals that we perform? And Spinoza will argue that no, it's not. That the rituals described in the Bible were intended for a certain time and place, but not necessarily for our time and place, that we don't necessarily need the same rituals that they needed. So actually, Dawn, would you mind reading this first paragraph here for us?
In the previous chapter, we show that the divine law, which makes men truly blessed and teaches the true life, is of universal application to all men. Indeed, our method of deducing it from human nature shows that it must be considered as innate in the human mind and inscribed therein, as it were. Now, ceremonial observances, those at least that are laid down in the Old Testament, were instituted for the Hebrews alone and were so adapted to the nature of their government that they could not be practiced by the individual, but involved the community as a whole. So it is evident that they do not pertain to the divine law and therefore do not contribute to blessedness and virtue. They have regard only to the election of the Hebrews, that is, as we demonstrated in chapter 3, to their temporal and material prosperity and peaceful government, and therefore could have been of practical value only while their state existed.
All right, so we'll pause there for a moment. So this is a very controversial statement to make about Jewish traditions. That it is essentially is to say that the rituals described in the Bible, what he calls the ceremonies described in the Bible, by which presumably he means things like sacrifice, were meant to apply only in that time and place. That they were some kind of a system of training for the people. And we'll see that actually even more clearly on the next page, that the people needed these ceremonies in their time and place, but that doesn't mean that they apply now. Oh, sorry, I meant to, I'm showing you the wrong thing. That doesn't mean that they apply now, that we're living in a different society. And his proof for that, or one of his proofs for that, is the Haftarah for Yom Kippur afternoon. This is a text that might be familiar to you. This is not part of the theological political treatise. I put in Isaiah 1, 16, 17, because that's what he's describing. He says, of all Isaiah's teaching, nothing is clearer than this, that the divine law, taken in a strict sense, signifies not ceremonial observance, but the universal law that consists in the true way of life. In chapter 1, verse 10, where the prophet calls upon his countrymen to hear from him the divine law, he first excludes from it sacrifices of every kind and all festivals. That's that Haftarah that you know. I don't want your fast. Is this the fast I desire? I don't want your fast. I don't want your sacrifices, Isaiah says. What do I want? What does God want instead? Wash yourselves clean. Put away your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wronged. Uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow. So he's using Isaiah to essentially argue that what sits in the kernel of the Bible, what's divine about the Bible, is actually the ethical laws. The other stuff is all some kind of a window dressing that was needed in its time and place. And we'll see actually in the next page, we'll see specifically why it was needed. And before I call on the hands, I want to show you something interesting Before we sort of derisively say to Spinoza, well, that doesn't sound like my Judaism. Look how much it does sound like our Judaism, or at least like early Reform Judaism. This is the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. Can you read that? There we go. The Pittsburgh Platform of 1885, the first statement that was put out by the Reform movement, by the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, to describe the beliefs of Reform Judaism. Paragraph 3. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So in some ways, the early Reform movement adopted Spinoza's view of ceremony, which was, and of religion, which was to say that the moral laws sit at the center of Jewish life, and that the rituals, according to this, are intended to, I think, to help us internalize those moral laws. Spinoza's not saying that. That's a later evolution. But Spinoza is the originator of this idea of the ceremonies, the rituals, as being a kind of a training system for the Jewish people. All right, I see a few hands, and then we'll have a little more detail or color about this on the next page. I don't remember what order they came in, so let's go Carla, Schweitzer's, and then Karen.
Okay, I found this part really like shocking, especially, I'm sorry, spoiler alert, when he's going to say later that the Jews were slaves, and so Moses had to tell them how to dress, what to eat, what to wear, when to do it, what, and all that stuff, and how we don't need any of that stuff now. So my question is, what is Spinoza suggesting we put in its place? Because I see all the things that we don't need, but I don't see what we do need in terms of a how to practice.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I know enough about that to be able to answer. I mean, he's certainly suggesting that we put intellectual speculation and learning in its place. What's not clear is whether Spinoza is advocating anything that looks like religious life anymore. He may well, is Spinoza simply a secularist who believes that we should learn science and that's the way to God? Maybe. He may be saying something like that, which again raises the question of why are we reading Spinoza as a Jewish thinker? And the reason that we read Spinoza as a Jewish thinker is because his view of religion has been so influential on liberal Judaism. As you can see right here in what we were just looking at, I mean, there's Spinoza right smack in the Pittsburgh Platform. And yet, as I think I said very early on, it's not clear that Spinoza sees himself as a Jewish thinker at all. He may well see himself as essentially departing Judaism, and that what he puts in its place is the intellectual, rational, and scientific pursuits that he believes will bring us closer to God. Earlier on in the Theological Political Treatise, he says something like, you can't even tell the difference between Jews, Muslims, and Christians anymore, except for the ways they dress and the languages they speak, that all people are basically the same. So he's calling for some kind of universalism, and he believes that divine law is universal, as we saw a moment ago, which means that what's in the place of religious practice is something universal rather than something particularistic, which makes it really interesting that his ideas have found their way into liberal Judaism. And truly, liberal Judaism is in many ways the act of trying to balance the universal with the particular, of having these universal ethical ideas, but also holding fast to some of the practices and the rituals that we see as being particularly and traditionally Jewish. And we'll talk more about that next year when we talk about people like Herman Cohen or Mordechai Kaplan, who have much more to say about ritual, or who value ritual in different ways. Schweitzer's, Karen, and then Susan D. Go ahead, Ira and Janice.
Well, I've never really wanted to think about Spinoza as being so influential on Reform Judaism. And I think that some of what we read today shows why he would have been excommunicated. And that's one of the things that I think we have to be careful about. because we as Reformed Jews don't like others to say that our views are not accepted and we should be excommunicated. So I had to state that right from the start. I also believe very much so that even the piece that you read from the platform, and I've studied the platforms and taught them, there is still that belief that we turn more to ritual than Spinoza wanted to accept. And so I think that there's another clear, I mean, when we get to Mordechai Kaplan and those, I think we'll have more. And when he chose this Isaiah statement, okay, but when you look at other statements of Isaiah, do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. And I think Spinoza specifically would leave that out because you can't walk humbly with God, because you need ritual,
right,
in order to do that. So that's my comments here.
I appreciate that. And I think that the rest of the history of Jewish philosophy, of modern Jewish philosophy, is the history of everybody else responding to Spinoza. Right? So Spinoza does something that nobody had done before. Spinoza frees religion from the constraints of the traditional way of reading the Bible. When he does that, he in some ways swings all the way to one end of the pendulum, which is to completely reject religious ritual. And I think next week we should ask Dr. Rosenthal whether, what his thoughts on Spinoza and ritual, because I don't want to speak for Spinoza, and he knows a lot more about it than I do. But in my sense of it, Spinoza swings all the way to an almost total rejection of traditional ritual. Jews have been contending with that ever since, because we believe, I think we very deeply believe what Spinoza says about the Bible, which is that it was written by people, that it has a divine kernel, that the ethics within it are divine. Those are ideas that are central to Reform Judaism. But also, we want to light Shabbat candles, and we want to practice. We want to pray in Hebrew, and we want to practice Judaism. And so we are ever after have we been responding to and struggling with what Spinoza said. But we can do that because Spinoza said it, essentially. And so that's the contribution he makes, is by completely turning our view of religion in the Bible on its head so that we can argue with him for the next 350 years. I think Karen is next.
I think we all, most of us here this evening feel very comfortable with this notion that the Bible was written by humans who were reflecting their own times. So that, that's not as shocking to us as it would have been in Spinoza's time. But there's so many of the laws in the Bible that are set out in great detail, conclude with words to the effect of, and this shall be a statute to you for all time, that they had this awareness of their place in time, and they wanted their words to echo through the generations to come. And that, I think that sort of butts up a little bit against what Spinoza says about them being solely fixed in time. The other point that I wanted to say, it's very interesting that we've gone in many ways quite far away from the original platforms of Reform Judaism, and have reinstated a lot of the rituals that certainly Spinoza would have rejected.
Yeah. And you can see how even by the time of the platform, which is 200 and something years later after Spinoza, they already had brought in more ritual, because Spinoza says nothing about ritual. He really says that, that Hebrews are not, Hebrews are not bound to practice their ceremonial rites since the destruction of their state, period. But by the time of the Pittsburgh platform, they're saying, we accept, here, I can bring that one back up. We accept as binding, we maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives. Well, we're maintaining ceremonies by doing that, where Spinoza was rejecting all of them. And to your point about the Bible, Karen, I think, first of all, let's note that Spinoza is not critiquing the Bible. Spinoza is critiquing the traditional reading of the Bible. He's critiquing traditional Judaism and traditional Christianity for their reading of the Bible. He's actually arguing that the Bible originally understood itself as existing in a certain time and place, but that later people misunderstood the Bible as containing 613 divine mitzvot that apply in all times and places. That doesn't speak to your point about the places where the Bible actually says this shall be a statute for all time. That's a great critique, and I don't know how he would answer that. But I think it's important to know that what he is actually critiquing here is the rabbinic and church readings of the Bible as opposed to the Bible itself. So I see Susan and then Phil.
Hi, Rabbi. I was just one, it's more of a comment than a question. Spinoza was rejecting Judaism and the rigidness of Judaism at his time. And I was wondering what he would think of Judaism today as either a conservative or reformed Jew, because I think today's Judaism is more along with his thinking than what he had. And I realized that by saying that, we probably wouldn't have reformed and conservative without Spinoza's intervention. So it's sort of an endless loop here. But basically, I guess I'm saying he's a man ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And I don't think he would have been had his comments be made in today's time. He wouldn't have been as controversial and probably more accepting of his faith.
Yeah, there's no question. I completely agree with everything you said. And I wondered the same thing. What would Spinoza think if he were to walk into Kol Ami during services? Would he say, oh, this is more like it? Or would he say, what are all these rituals doing here? Right? I don't know which of those two things he would have said, but I do know that there's one thing that, with regard to ritual, one thing that I think we do receive from Spinoza is the idea that the rituals are human. So Spinoza teaches us in this chapter, in fact, we'll go on to that in just a minute. He teaches us essentially that the rituals exist for the purposes of helping the people live in certain ways, helping the people maintain their way of life, teaching them certain things, cultural integrity during the period of the monarchy in the land of Israel. If we apply that further, if we apply it in our own time and place, then we get the idea that the rituals we perform exist for purposes for our purposes. Why do we light Shabbat candles? Do I light Shabbat candles because I believe that God commanded me to do so? Well, no. I light Shabbat candles because it connects me with tradition. It connects me with my ancestors. It reminds me to be grateful. It serves as a barrier between the ordinary and the weekend Shabbat, so that I can remind myself to rest. There's a whole slew of reasons why I light Shabbat candles, but none of them are because God said so. So Spinoza will argue here in this chapter that essentially the rituals exist for all these sociological, psychological, spiritual reasons. And he's saying we don't need them anymore because of that. We're saying, yes, we do. All those things our ancestors needed, we still need them. So in that sense, we are following what we might call a Spinozan religion, which is that we're performing rituals for our reasons, for our purposes, rather than because God commanded them. Phil, and then Alex.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, was Spinoza alone in this, or did he have like a group of followers that were like some kind of a sect?
So there wasn't a sect in the sense that he wasn't seen as anybody's rabbi, but he did have followers and friends who were starting to read his ideas. Certainly someone like Descartes had said similar things about the Christian Bible. Spinoza has a lot to say about the Christian Bible also. We're just looking at his Jewish stuff here. And but what I don't know is whether Spinoza had, and what I don't think, is that he had Jewish followers that were starting to think about Judaism in these ways. Because remember, Spinoza's not talking about Judaism. We're interpreting him in the light of Judaism, and we're talking about all the ways that our Judaism is descended from his ideas. But I think Spinoza would be surprised to learn that we continue to practice something that looks so much like traditional Judaism, but still has some of his ideas at the center of it. So I think that Spinoza's his crowd was largely not a Jewish crowd. It was a philosophical crowd. He saw himself as part of the philosophical discourse that was going on in Europe at the time. Alex, go ahead.
Thanks. Rabbi, would I be wrong in thinking that Spinoza is not against ritual, but rather against a certain type of ritual? Because if I interpret what we've been saying properly, ethics and reason and the study of the world that surrounds us is the way to approach the divine. And that is not different from the reasons for ritual today, right? We practice certain things, amongst other reasons, for trying to get closer, trying to understand the divinity. So it is maybe for him, ritual is not, putting tefillin during the mornings, but rather trying to understand the world or behaving ethically. That is the right to lead him to the divinity.
Mm-hmm. Well, those are certainly religious actions as far as he's concerned. I don't know if he would use the word ritual to describe them, but those are the religious actions. And what I think Spinoza doesn't have is a connection that we often have, which sounds like putting on my tefillin helps me act ethically, right? So I think Spinoza doesn't have that, and we do. And you're right that what he's doing then is saying religious actions are different than what you thought they were. That those rituals, those are not religious actions. Religious actions look like intellectual pursuit and ethical action. And to prove it, he quotes Isaiah right here, right? What Isaiah is really saying, he says, is behave ethically. But we know, because we've read the whole book of Isaiah, that Isaiah wasn't rejecting the existence of ritual. Isaiah was in this one particular place, was elevating ethics was elevating ethics over ritual performed without ethics. So it's a selective reading of Isaiah here, but he's not the only one to make it.
Sorry, and the second part of my question is, he criticizes superstition at the very beginning of our class today, and I find it very difficult many times to draw the line between what constitutes a pious, religious, ritual practice from superstition, right? I find it myself difficult. I'm not sure others may have different answers, but many times what we practice might sound superstitious to others because it doesn't form, part of a logical, reason of why you have to do it.
Agreed. And so, I think one of the things that postmodernism has given us is the idea that what we might have previously termed irrational could also be rational. So I was having a conversation tonight with two couples that are both getting married. Both there's in each couple there's one Jewish partner. Both Jewish partners said, "I grew up keeping kosher. I don't keep kosher anymore, but I would never drink a glass of milk with a piece of chicken. It just doesn't feel right." So we might say, well, that's completely irrational, right? You don't keep kosher, you'll eat pork, you'll eat shellfish, but you won't mix meat and dairy. What's rational about that? But is it really so irrational? It's a sense of connectedness to Jewish tradition, a connectedness to something. I don't want to psychoanalyze them, but I don't think that's irrational, in fact. And so, I don't know where that line is between superstition and reason, but to your point, Spinoza thinks he knows where it is, right? And that makes him in many ways a modernist and not a postmodernist. That's what makes him someone living 300 years ago, as opposed to someone living now after Kaplan. I want to read this next page. Oh, Susan, go ahead, and then we'll read this final page. Susan. All right, well, let's go on and read here. Because this page in many ways is going to bring together the religious and the political stuff. So Spinoza has argued in parts that we won't read that are later on, he's argued that the Bible must be read as in the context of the people who wrote it, like we said before. He has argued that divine law is the ethical law and that there are elements of divine law in the Bible, but that not all of the Bible constitutes divine law. He's also argued on this next page, which we're not going to read in its entirety, that there's no such thing as miracles. No event can occur to contravene nature. He says, therefore, it follows that the word miracle can be understood only with respect to men's beliefs. It means simply an event whose natural cause we, or at any rate, the writer or the narrator of the miracle cannot explain. So what the Bible thought was miracles was things that they couldn't explain by science, essentially, he said. There's his progressivism again. He believes that we know things they didn't know, and future people will know things we don't know. Therefore, nothing can act outside the laws of nature, he said. And in all that, he now needs to explain to us what these ceremonial rites, what role they played in ancient Israel, why these things existed, and what that might have to do with our society. So Rochelle, would you mind reading here for us? It says, it now remains. You're muted, Rochelle.
It now remains for me to show how and why ceremonial rites serve to preserve and strengthen the Hebrew state. This I shall demonstrate as briefly as possible, arguing from universally valid principles. The formation of a society is advantageous, even absolutely essential, not merely for security against enemies, but for the efficient organization of an economy. If men did not afford one another mutual aid, they would lack both the skill and the time to support and preserve themselves to the greatest possible extent.
Will you read one more paragraph, please?
Now, if men were so constituted by nature as to desire nothing but what is prescribed by true reason, society would stand in no need of any laws. Nothing would be required but to teach men true moral doctrine, and they would then act to their true advantage of their own accord, wholeheartedly and freely. But human nature is far differently constituted. All men do indeed seek their own advantage, but by no means from the dictates of sound reason. For the most part, the objectives they seek and judge to be beneficial are determined only by fleshy desire, and they are carried away by their emotions, which take no account of the future or of other considerations. Hence, no society can subsist without government and coercion, and consequently without laws to control and restrain men's lusts and their unbridled urges. Yet human nature will not submit to unlimited repression.
All right, so we've heard this from him before. If only people would all just exist entirely by reason, we'd be fine. We wouldn't need all these laws. We wouldn't need all this coercion if only people were rational. But most people are not. Therefore, we need a society where people can become more rational. From this, it follows, he says, first, that either the entire community, if possible, should hold the reins of government as a single body. He's calling for democracy, so that all are thus required to render obedience to themselves and no one to his equal. Or alternatively, if sovereignty is invested in a few men or in one alone, he should be endowed with some extraordinary quality, that the he being the leader here, should be endowed with some extraordinary quality, or must at least make every effort to convince the masses of this. Secondly, in every state, laws should be so devised that men may be influenced not so much by fear as by hope of some good that they urgently desire. For in this way, each will be eager to do his duty. In our prayer book, in the Modim prayer, it says something toward the end about, may we live by our hopes and not by our fears. I don't know if they knew they were quoting Spinoza when they wrote that passage. I'm going to have to do a little research and find out. So he says, we need to organize our society in such a way that either everybody will have access to education and nobody will have to submit themselves to anybody else, and we'll all, live by reason. Or if somebody's got to be in charge, then the somebody should be somebody extraordinary who will help us all live by our hopes and not by our fears. What does this have to do with the Bible, you might be asking? Well, for Spinoza, the one such person like that who has existed is Moses. Moses set up a society that would allow people through these laws and ceremonies to live by their hopes and not by their fears. Moses had a superior intellectual capacity and a superior closeness with God. And Moses therefore set up a society that would, here, if we jump to the bottom of the next paragraph, in doing so, he made every effort to see that the people should do their duty willingly rather than through fear. This then was the reason why Moses, by his divine power and authority, introduced a state religion. It was to make the people do their duty from devotion rather than fear. So Spinoza argues here that the origin of Judaism, the origin of the Jewish ceremonial laws, was Moses trying to create an optimum society in ancient times by giving people control and giving slaves. These people had no ability to govern themselves. By giving these slaves a set of laws that would, if you see here, that would govern the way they eat, dress, cut their hair, shave, make merry, reap their fields, plowing, sowing, reaping, everything would be ritualized, he says, in order that this group of people would be able to learn how to live by their hopes and not by their fears, how to develop their rational capacity to come closer to God so that they could create a society that would finally be in line with the dictates of reason. And guess when that finally happened, as far as Spinoza is concerned? In the 17th century. It was starting to happen right now. Here we are in this time when we are finally emerging from the Dark Ages. We're finally emerging from the superstitions of the church and of the synagogue. We're finally emerging into the light. And what do the thinkers of the 17th century call themselves? They call themselves the Enlightenment thinkers, right? We still refer to them as the Enlightenment thinkers because they believed, and in many ways, we as a society still believe, that this was the culmination of the development of the rational spirit over the course of many centuries. Spinoza believes that Moses had been the original creator of it. So we're now emerging into a time and place where we no longer require these ceremonial rituals because people can live by their hopes and not by their fears through reason and through science. And we're now going to create that kind of society. So while it sounds optimistic, we also recognize all the ways that it sits at the center of our society, both politically in our liberal democracy and also religiously in our liberal Judaism. But we also can recognize all the ways that it doesn't, that we still value ritual, that we still recognize all the ways that people are not living by their rational faculty. I think in many ways, scholars have argued that the Holocaust was sort of the nail in the coffin of the modern project, of the idea that humans were ultimately going to perfect society, which is really what Spinoza is promulgating here. So in the 5 minutes that we have left, I want to turn from religious and political philosophy back to his philosophy of personal meaning. We'll look at the final page. Yeah, there's a bunch I'm skipping here about the way he reads the Bible and all that good stuff. Susan, go ahead. I see your hand, and then I'm just going to read a couple of last propositions and wrap up.
Quick question. He talks about we should be educated and therefore reason will take over and we can all govern ourselves. Where does he stand with good and evil? Because evil does exist, unfortunately, in our world. And without government and some type of order there, evil can run havoc.
Yeah, he's not calling for anarchy. It's not that there's no government, but he believes that he has faith in the people. Unlike Maimonides, he has faith in the people. He believes that the people are capable of developing a rational capacity and governing themselves en masse. And he believes also that the more we develop our rational faculty, learn about the world, learn about ourselves, come closer to God, the more good we will be, the more we will want goodness for each other, and therefore that society will have less of what we're terming evil. And so that really is actually what sits at the center of Spinoza's quest. His quest is, if you remember from our first session, his quest is for what he terms the good, what was the language he uses? The true good. Here it is, back on page 5. This is what he terms the true good. His quest is for knowledge about him, myself and the world around me and the ways that I'm connected with the world around me. And he believes that as long, here I'm back in the ethics, we had to have just a little bit more geometrical stuff. As long as we are not assailed by emotions that are contrary to our nature, we have the power to arrange and associate affections of the body according to the order of the intellect. In other words, if you control your emotions, you can learn by intellect. We could have a whole other conversation about Spinoza and emotion. He's so negative about emotion. Either way, though, he believes that intellect is the way to God. He who clearly and distinctly understands himself and his emotions loves God. And the more so, the more he understands himself and his emotions. So by understanding ourselves, we also understand God. And by understanding God, by developing our rational capacity, we understand ourselves better. Not only that, but the mind's intellectual love toward God is the love of God, wherewith God loves God's self, not insofar as he is infinite, but insofar as he can be explicated through the essence of the human mind considered under the form of eternity. That is to say, you know where the Bible says that God loves us, or God loves the world, or God loves God's self, or whatever? That's you. You as a part of God. Remember, you're a part of God. We talked about that last week. You as a part of God. When you show love for God, you are actualizing God's love for the world and for you and for God's self. And finally, that's what we call blessing. Blessedness is not a reward of virtue, but virtue itself. So that act that we've just been describing of coming closer to God, that is a reward in and of itself. You don't do that in order to attain a reward. You do it because it is its own reward. We do not enjoy blessedness because we keep our lusts in check. Lusts means, passions in check. On the contrary, it is because we enjoy blessedness that we are able to keep our lusts in check. So the more we develop ourselves as learners and thinkers and understanders of the world, the more we will govern ourselves in ways that we are ultimately proud of, in ways that are pursuit of truth and good, rather than pursuit of, I keep forgetting the 3 words, riches, honor, and sensual pleasure. And that in and of itself is a reward. And he says it's not easy. I'll just read, this is the last paragraph Spinoza ever wrote. This is the last paragraph of the Ethics. If the road I have pointed out as leading to this goal seems very difficult, yet it can be found. Indeed, what is so rarely discovered is bound to be hard. For if salvation were ready to hand and could be discovered without great toil, how could it be that it is almost universally neglected? All things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. So it's not easy, he says. None of this is easy. But what we have as human beings is the capacity to develop ourselves as intellectual beings, as lifelong learners, which is a deeply Jewish concept, and in so doing, to come to understand the world around us, to come to understand ourselves as part of the world around us, and to come to understand ourselves as part of God. And that, he says, that's the true good. That's what we're all after in this world. And even though it's not easy to do, in fact, it's very, very difficult to do, it is its own reward. And as he says, all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. It is the most excellent pursuit. So I want to thank you for all your questions and discussion over the last 3 weeks. When we meet next week, we're gonna be here with Professor Michael Rosenthal, who is an expert in Spinoza, and we'll have some, as I said, some greater depth and some things that that I didn't know. If you have questions for Dr. Rosenthal, the best thing to do is email them to me, and I'll collect them and pass them on to him, and then he can address the questions that have come up over the course of the last 3 weeks that we've studied together. Let me just thank again the members of the Adult Ed Committee. Oh, thank you, Karen. That's my email address. Thank you to the members of the Adult Ed Committee. Thank you to the members of the Great Jewish Thinkers subcommittee. Thank you to our donor, our anonymous donor, who is here and who helped make this program possible. And thank you to everybody who both attended and who gave to make this this program possible. And I am looking forward to seeing all of you again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, and everyone.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Rabbi. Can I ask that the link to